through, what you were
Yeah.
tunneling through.
Yeah, so we had this really great series of experiments where we could develop what we called a tunneling timetable, a timetable of tunneling rates versus distance. So we could give that tunneling timetable to theoreticians and say, okay, here are the tunneling timetables in different proteins. Some of them had lots of scatter, others had less scatter. And then the theoreticians could come up with models saying there's got to be somehow, these are coupled somehow, there's got to be bonds or something in between and things like that that are allowing these electrons to move all these distances. And so David then, David set up what's called a tunneling pathway model that explained our the scatter in our experiments and a whole bunch of things, and able to put it on a really great fundamental basis. So, but our experiments in the from 74, it took us from 1974 to 1981 to actually build a molecule that we could work on. It took us about 8 years to build this molecule and characterize it. So there was a lot of experimental work involved in this to get to the point where we could actually do an experiment. Then we had to invent a technology, a photochemical technology, to actually get these rates out of these molecules. So there were two aspects: building these super molecules, and secondly, developing a technology that would actually allow us to get these rates out. And there were famous people in the field like Jack Halpern who said, you will never ever get a technology that would allow you to get these rates cleanly out. And we clearly did. Famous professor at the university, he said, well, Harry, you really have done this. and so he said, I didn't think you could do it, but you did. So that's how it all worked out. And then more and more, we're now looking at something called hopping, which is multi-step tunneling. We're looking at tyrosines and tryptophanes that allow you to move electrons much further than 3 nanometers by going through these redox active sites in the middle. And that we're now engaged in trying to understand all of these hopping processes and what they may do. We think they're responsible for saving us from oxidative degradation in our livers and in our cells. We think that hopping through tyrosines and tryptophanes are saving us from degradation, from oxidative degradation by oxygen. So now we're very involved in this because we think a lot of proteins have built-in tyrosines and tryptophanes as protection from oxidative degradation, particularly cytochrome P450, which is an extremely important protein and metabolizes a lot of things and keeps us alive. We think that cytochrome P450 is completely protected by these tyrosines and tryptophanes. And if it didn't have them, it wouldn't last very long. It wouldn't turn over very long, and our livers and spleens would degrade quickly, and you wouldn't live more than about a year or two. So we're very involved now in this protection, this oxidative protection now. And David has contributed a lot to that as well. He looked at our first thing, and what happens really is we write a paper and then he writes a better paper.
Oh, you're too kind. No, so, your work totally inspires us. Yeah.
Anyway, we've been doing this back and forth for a long time, David.
That's right. So Harry, I arrived in Pasadena in 1980, and within my first year, your metal modified protein experiments were being reported. And so we knew that we would have the sort of theorist's dream experiment for electron tunneling in biology.
Yeah, these were the first electron transfer experiments that you could actually do theory on.
That's correct. It was too hard before that because you didn't know where the donors and acceptors were.
You knew where everything was at the instant of electron transfer.
That's right. So I arrived just as this beautiful body of work was beginning to unfold. And we knew there was an opportunity, but we had to build a theoretical foundation to describe, as Harry said, the tunneling through bonds, through space, through solvent. And we didn't have the theoretical foundation for that. So that's what my PhD was about. And I was having so much fun with it, and I saw the opportunity. I couldn't bear to leave Pasadena, so I went up to the Jet Propulsion Lab as a postdoc. And it was in those days that we really started to collaborate intensively on the biophysical systems and developed the pathway theory and had all these intensive interactions about mechanism and kinetics of electron tunneling. And you know, these are incredibly complex systems. It's amazing we could do anything with them using theory, in fact. But there was really quite an intense back and forth between theory and experiment over those years, interpreting, designing new experiments, reinterpreting, you know, thanks to Harry's flash quench tools that he told us about. We had this amazing set of data. We could look for primary, secondary, tertiary structure effects on electron tunneling. We could try to understand the scatter in the rate versus distance plots, the timetables that he told you about. So it was really a very exciting time, and continues, as you said, into understanding hopping mechanisms, oxidative damage protection, extracellular electron transfer, interspecies electron transfer, you know, photosynthesis, artificial photosynthesis. Yeah, it's quite incredible.
Collaboration is also incredibly important in complex fields, and both David and I had great collaborators. I had a laser specialist named Jay Winkler, who was instrumental in inventing the flash quench experiment, and David had Jose Onachuk as a collaborator during this period who he could bounce ideas off of, because in a way they were very similar in terms of interaction. David and I were in the thick of the problems. Jose was more of a physicist who had kind of a wild character who had lots of crazy ideas you could bounce off of, and Jay was a laser specialist. And so our interactions, I would say, with those two people were instrumental in getting us where we got, David.
That's right. It was really a team. You know, all four of us, we bounce ideas off of each other in every possible combination. We built all sorts of crazy models. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work. There was, you know, and Harry also helped us out with researchers. So he had an undergraduate summer researcher who wanted to come to Pasadena, and Harry didn't know what to do with him. So he sent him up to, I think that's the story, sent him up to JPL to work with me, and he wrote some of the most critical software for identifying these tunneling pathways. And it's just, you know, because through these human interactions, collaborations, intensive discussions, that opportunities like that arise. You just have to say yes and embrace them, right? All these crazy ideas and difficult experiments. It's great fun.
Yeah, his name was Joe Betts.
Joe Betts.
And Joe Betts showed up, and I didn't know I could tell he really wanted to do theory, and I didn't want to do theory with him. I said, well, David is the guy for him, so I sent him to David.
Yeah, and called me up one day and said, Joe Betts is coming to Pasadena.
We had a terrific time together, and Joe and David published a very important paper in Science that really set the stage for a lot of the theory work. And
but you know, Harry, if Joe hadn't come along, if you hadn't sent him up to talk with me and work with me, that paper never would have happened. You know, so it's these connections that are so wonderful. Yeah.
Well, Natasha, have you had enough of us?
Professor, I think David has a very interesting question to ask from Professor David, especially regarding quantum mechanics and incorporating that in electron transfer. Right, Devinder?
Yes. I have a question. My next question is for the Professor David. Professor David, it was in your graduate studies that you discovered the tunneling pathway interferences and tunneling energy effects. Since that time, how far has this knowledge evolved, especially in the context of biological molecules?
Okay, so Indeed, we developed these ideas of tunneling pathways, simple tunneling pathways, and tunneling energy effects in my PhD research. I think for me, and as well as for my PhD advisor, John Hopfield, we were certainly interested in protein-mediated electron transfer because of its role in photosynthesis and oxidative phosphorylation. But Harry's experiments had not entirely unfolded yet. And so we turned to small molecule model systems to develop our early theories. And that's where we learned how to pose simple models for electron tunneling through covalent bonds, through space, through solvent, and develop that theoretical framework. It was not until I was a postdoc that I and as Harry said, Jose Onishik were able to take those kind of core ideas about how electrons tunnel through chemical bonds and through space and map them onto the protein problem, which is so much more complex. So in retrospect, I could tell a story as though it were all planned, but it wasn't planned at all. It was fortuitous that we had these beautiful experiments coming out from the Gray group, and we'd been working on the foundational issues surrounding electron tunneling in chemistry in my PhD, that we were able to bring those ideas together. If not for Harry's experiment, I'm sure I would have gone on to some other problems in theoretical chemistry or biochemistry, and we would have set aside our tunneling theories. But because his great experiments were emerging at that time, we could take what we developed in the sort of foundational understanding of tunneling processes and move them into these very rich, complex biophysical systems. So it was really a happy sort of evolution enabled by the emergence of those experiments.
Well, I'm glad I could put you to work.
That's right. You provided job security. It's been great.
You would have gone off into some irrelevant something or other.
Absolutely. Saved my career. Yeah. No, it was so much fun. Really so much fun.
And Professor Harry, to move on from this topic in discussion, shall we talk a bit about the CCI Solar Powering the Planet project?
Yeah, I got into that because I had done some work on photochemical hydrogen evolution in the 70s, and gotten out of the field to work on the protein systems. But in the late 90s, various oil companies came to me and encouraged me to get back into solar conversion, because they said, well, we're going to need that in the future. And BP especially came to me and said, we think our company is going to become a solar company sometime in the mid 21st century. So I got together with Dan Nocera and Nate Lewis, two of my students, very, very famous students who were into solar stuff. And we started CCI Solar and started trying to build systems that would split water to make hydrogen fuel. And we carried out a CCI Solar program for about 12 years. And recruited a lot of students and postdocs to work on solar devices, and we're quite successful in that. Built photoanodes and photocathodes and membranes, and that work is very, very successful. We also started a solar army of high school students who are now doing solar experiments, but our solar program ended 2 years ago. Our CCI solar program is no longer going, but the solar army still continues on a basis. But I've gone back in my lab just to concentrate on my electron tunneling and hopping experiments. So I'm no longer doing any direct solar experiments. I've linked to the the people we developed over that time who are carrying on that work. Many of my students are carrying it on. Jillian Dempsey, who went to Chapel Hill, and Mike Rose, who went to Texas, and I've got a whole bunch of folks who, Brian Hunter, who is now at Harvard. A lot of my students and postdocs are carrying that on, but I've transitioned back to things that I really want to work on now that I think are bigger challenges, frankly, for me.
Question, Mr. David. Being a theoretical scientist, how do you guide the influence, the experimental design of their interpretations? And how important is to be conscious of experimental component when developing a hypothesis?
I think it's everything. I think this connection with experiment is everything, as we've been discussing. I think you can go off for some time and develop methodology, but if you'd like that methodology to be impactful, you probably would start with some experiments or some experimental challenges in mind, whether it's something about electron tunneling or whether you would like to understand, what makes high temperature superconductors function, or what makes what underpins some other chemical or physical process. So I think the connection with experiment is always going to be a driver for theoretical development. Some may be more foundational, some may be more applied, but I think they're always going to have experiments in mind. And then as the theory you're developing grows and matures, then I think this kind of interaction that we've been describing between Harry's group and my own really accelerates the pace of progress on both sides. I think it's easy as a theorist to fall into a trap of doing calculations, analysis in isolation. I mean, it's fun. We like to calculate things. We like to derive equations and do integrals and things like that. It's easy to become a little bit isolated doing that. But I think the real payoff comes when you can touch base with experiments, and especially if you can design a new experiment and make an honest prediction, where you sort of make yourself a little bit vulnerable because you may be wrong, right? The systems that people care about tend to be complicated, poorly understood, maybe even poorly characterized. So you put yourself a little bit out there to fail, but I think the upside is tremendous if you can make those strong connections. Yeah.
And for Professor Harry, so being an experimental scientist, how do you process this information that's given by a theoretical scientist and actually use it for your experiments and deal with it further?
Well, I usually, I usually put it goes this way. You do experiments, you interpret them to some level. And usually a theoretician will then, if you're dealing with them directly, will see an opportunity to do the theory at a higher level and in more detail. And that's, I think, the way that David and I have worked together for years. We put the thing out as experiments. We interpret them to a certain kind of level, and then David sees an opportunity to dig in much deeper. And the other way is when you publish an experiment and develop a mechanism that that a theoretician looks at that you don't really know that well, and the theoretician calls you and say, well, your mechanism is wrong. I've just made a calculation that shows that this intermediate that you proposed can't possibly do this reaction that you suggested. So that's the one where you get slightly annoyed initially because the theoretician is telling you that your mechanism is wrong. And then though, if you're smart, you listen to the theoretician and you think about it, and then you design an experiment to test the theoretician's idea about how it might work. And I can cite cases where the theoretician has annoyed me, but I've designed experiments to see if the theoretician was right and I was wrong. And in a lot of cases, the theoretician was right and I was wrong. And our next experiment has shown that. This is how science advances.
That's right.
The back and forth between theoreticians and experimentalists. And this brings me to a very important point for you. You should not be afraid of making mistakes. You will make mistakes, particularly if you're at the frontier of any field. You'll make lots of mistakes. People will point out these mistakes, and you should look at that and think about it, and admit. You should admit mistakes immediately. You shouldn't try to, stonewall, as we say, somebody, or back it up or argue with them. You should move on and say, yeah, you're right and I'm wrong. And now it's going to be even better because the science is going to move forward and it's going to be even better than it was when I thought I was right. And that's always been the case in my lab. When I've been wrong and somebody's pointed out, usually a theoretician, and I've done some experiments to show I was wrong, I publish that, of course, immediately and say I was wrong, the theory was right, I was wrong. And it leads to much better work. Science advances much more rapidly this way. The worst thing to do is think that you're never going to make a mistake. And the worst thing you can do is work with some advisor who always wants to be right. You should not pick an advisor who is so overbearing that he or she thinks, look, I'm always right about something. My ideas are always right. This is the worst advisor you could ever get involved with, because this is how science fraud comes about. Is advisors who think they're always right, and students who feel that they have to show the advisor is right. This has led to fraud in many cases, and the student always gets blamed for it, not the professor. So stay away from advisors who think they're always right. Find an advisor who thinks he or she's always wrong. In my life, I've been over and over and over again. And my great mentor, Arnold Beckman, the great inventor in the 20th century, had a saying. He said, if you're not making mistakes, it's pretty sure you're not doing anything that's very interesting. You're only doing boring stuff. If you're not making mistakes, then you're not doing anything that anybody wants to hear about. And so that's my advice to you is make mistakes, admit it, correct them, move on. And theoretician tells you you're wrong, you better listen to them. You may be right and they might be wrong, but on the other hand, they might be right and you might be wrong. And over the years, my interactions with theorists have been in that direction. They have told me that in several cases I was wrong and about an interpretation of an experiment, particularly some mechanistic experiment. And I've been annoyed for about a day, and then you go back and, well, that theoretician might be right. I better check it out. I better do another experiment. I better do a better experiment and find out. And I think that back and forth is really the way science works.
So Harry, I was involved in a scientific controversy about 25 years ago, and I called you to discuss aspects of the experiments and the theory. And what you told me was, Dave, don't worry, the truth is going to win. And I think that's the moral of the story here, right? Science moves forward. It's okay to be wrong. Science will advance as a result.
There's no point in trying to stonewall anybody, because in science, the truth will always come out.
It wins in the end.
Somewhere. And if you try to keep onto something that is wrong, and you try to, because you don't want to admit the mistake, then ultimately you're going to look really bad.
Right. Right.
when it
Right.
comes to that. So the
Right.
best thing you can do is say, boy, I was really wrong about that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
I was really wrong. I'm gonna correct that. I'm gonna do a better experiment and correct that. And so uh, that's probably the best advice I could give you, young people.
That's very true, Professor. I think
Yeah.
I think that's something we have to accept.
Where are we?
Basically, what we wanted to ask you further was regarding your teaching methods. And
Oh yeah, sure. Oh yeah, I got to talk about my teaching methods. Yeah. Well, I don't give lectures. I have a different style. It knows. I talk to people in the audience. I ask questions. I interact. I think lectures, canned lectures, are very boring. I think you have to. I think you have to get students involved in discussions. And I've always interacted with students during my courses. I don't give lectures anymore. I think working problems is very, very important for students. Working problems and then discussing the answers with people. The students get so much more out of courses if they work problems and study in advance, and then they can interact with the professor about what the problems mean and how to solve them and so forth. I don't give, I think lectures can be extremely boring. Lecture after lecture after lecture. I think interaction is the key.
And Professor, if I may add to that, it doesn't get us thinking as well. So problems and interactions actually get us thinking, whereas in lectures we just try to memorize. And
I think it's a back and forth with students. I think you have to get students involved with you right away. That's my teaching method. And I've decided lectures without any interaction with students are essentially worthless.
I've come to the same point, Harry. I started giving formal lectures, and now it's all we call it flipped classrooms. We spend time solving problems. And the students end up owning the material.
And this pandemic we're going through is going to change the way teaching is done forever. Teaching will never be done like it was before. The pandemic now has made these interactive Zoom things the way to go, and people are recording lectures so students could listen to them if they want to. But the actual interaction with students in the Zoom, it should be just discussion things. And so I don't think we'll ever go back to the old way, David.
I agree with you, Harry. It's been shown that the students own the material and retain it longer if they learn it in this problem-solving discussion mode, right? So they can go online and watch our lectures or mini lectures, whatever we might like to post.
But in the teaching, this actual in-person and the in-person stuff should be discussions and interactions.
We reached the same point.
I've decided that. I don't know. I gave a lecture on my teaching methods called I won this Feynman Prize, and that should be on YouTube somewhere. I think you could see about that you could go on YouTube and see my Feynman, my lecture I gave on winning the Feynman Prize. I think it's on YouTube. I've got a lot of lectures I got a lot of things on YouTube.
So Harry, as we think about writing textbooks in the 21st century, I see the challenge as writing kind of guidebooks for this sort of problem-oriented learning, rather than writing the kinds of textbooks we wrote 50 years ago. I think it's how do we guide that student-oriented learning? I think that's
I think textbooks are probably a thing of the past.
Still useful, but I think to guide the teaching, we need something new.
Yeah, well, Natasha is going to have to solve all this for her. Her life is ahead of her. She's going to have to write all the new things that people are going to have to learn. So, Natasha, you've got a big challenge in front of you.
I will definitely send you my thoughts on that, Professor. And
Finally,
as a final question,
as a final
what we want to
question,
ask you is, Devinder, go ahead.
Professor,
You
what?
better ask David something.
It's okay.
We love to hear about the fifth classroom mode, more about fifth classroom mode, Professor David.
Well, we've heard more or less about it from Harry. The idea is to get the students engaged to solve problems and discuss problems within student groups as well as with the faculty. And as Harry said, throw away the boring stuff, or you know, you can watch our little mini lectures on your cell phones outside of class, and use the class time to discuss the really hard questions. So yeah, I think we've come to the same point of teaching in this mode. For me, it evolved over.
I think everyone's coming around to that point, David.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that when you do quantitative tests of what students retain a few years later, they retain much more when they learn in this active setting.
Yeah.
And so we'll wrap this up now. So like as a final note, what advice would you like to give to us, especially like undergraduates in Sri Lanka?
Go ahead, Harry.
I would. My advice is to maybe look into schools. I'm not sure exactly how you connect to undergrad schools. I guess this would be graduate programs.
Yes.
Connect to various graduate programs. Look and see people that you think you might like to work with, and email them and see which ones answer you and how enthusiastic they seem to be. I think you have to engage some people at places in the States and some universities that you might want to go to and see. You got to get into some back and forth with them, get some people interested in discussing with you the opportunities at places now, because you have probably you've got a very fine education in Sri Lanka now, and you need to connect with people at places, people that you might like to work with in your fields, and see who gets back to you and who looks interested, and I would apply to the places where the people get back to you and express interest.
I would add to that, if there's any way to get undergraduate research experience, whether it's in Sri Lanka or perhaps in a collaborative project that might involve some of those potential future mentors, that would be terrific.
Yeah, I think, have you done undergraduate research at Sri Lanka?
Professor, right now I'm doing it. I'm working on S1P pathways, signaling pathways, and to check the proliferation of C6 glioma cells. So basically cell culture.
Okay. Well, then if you've got undergraduate research experience, the thing to do is to try to engage somebody and tell them what you're doing, and as David says, maybe get involved in some kind of collaboration or something. I mean, I think the best thing to do is to look on websites of universities. There are lots of universities with lots of great chemistry programs. The strength of United States chemistry is that there are probably 50 institutions that all have strong chemistry departments. Chemistry is very, very strong in the U.S. And so every state has, California has, you know, probably 10 schools that are very strong. North Carolina has at least 3 very strong graduate programs. So every state has strong graduate programs. So there are probably 50 in the US. So you have to, you have to find a couple of places where the professors answer your emails and are willing to discuss graduate work with you. So I think this is a matter of doing research on websites and finding places where you can email people and see who answers you and see who gets excited, because there will probably be several professors who'd love to have you at their universities.
Another option is to look for travel fellowships that might bring you to conferences in the US, say Gordon Research Conferences. I know there are some fellowships that can help with international students. So if you're doing undergraduate research and you have some results that you're very excited about, you might find support to come to a Gordon conference to present a poster and network with the community here. That can be tough, but you know, because there are not so many fellowships to travel. But
there are Gordon Research seminars. There are Gordon Research seminars which students come to.
Right.
And you should look into those in your area. The best thing you could do would be try to get a fellowship or a scholarship to come to one of those. There are those available. And then you can meet people. Somehow you've got to meet a lot of folks here. I mean, you've met David and me, and you can always email us for advice.
Thank you so much for that.
I won't forget you, Natasha.
Thank you, Professor.
I'll be happy. I mean, you can always email me and tell me what you're doing and so forth, and I might have lots of good ideas about universities that have folks in the field that you want to go into, and I'll be happy to do that.
Thank you, Professor. So definitely when I'm done with my degree, I will consult you. Thank you so much.
Okay, consult me, consult David.
Yeah, absolutely. No, use your networks to find your way. We may or may not be the right people to serve as a potential mentor, but we have friends who may be.
Yeah.
And so thank you so much for both of you, professors. And we are really sorry for keeping you this long, but we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Well, we've had a ball. We've had a ball. We keep talking. That's why we've had it's been almost 2 hours.
Yeah. It's so much fun to see Harry again and to meet you in Sri Lanka.
Great
yeah,
fun.
It's a
Thank
blast.
you so much. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you very much. So
I think you're going to have great careers, you two. Great careers. You look terrific to me.
Thank you, Professor. So,
okay, bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Lovely to see you all.
Everybody.
Concludes our discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Harry and Professor David, for taking time out of your busy schedules and joining with us and sharing your invaluable thoughts. It was indeed a pleasure. I think we all got to know an unseen side of 2 very distinguished professors in the field, which would greatly help young scientists like us to develop further. So to wrap things up, it was Professor Harry Gray from Caltech and Professor David Beratan from Duke University who joined with us. And please stay tuned for more videos on interviews of eminent scientists in this field. Have a great day.
That will be nice.
I think rehearsing, you know, when I was 11 years old, I won a prize. I think in the 5th grade, I won a prize as the best student in the 5th grade. And I was asked to give a 2-minute talk accepting this award on a stage in a little town in Kentucky where I grew up. So I memorized this 2-minute speech, and I kept working on it and memorizing it because, of course, I was extremely nervous about giving this talk. And And so my mother, who adored me, was sitting in the front row, looking really happy. And I started giving the talk I had memorized, and I was so nervous that right in the middle of the talk, I forgot the next sentence.
Oh.
Just stood there, frozen.
Ooh.
I couldn't say a word because I had memorized the speech. And if you memorize something, and if you then forget something, you can't do anything. You're lost. When I was 11 years old, I made a promise to myself I would never ever memorize anything again. I would just say what was on my mind anytime, and that's the way I've lived my life, and that's worked out okay. So my first advice to you: don't memorize anything.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Except the periodic table. I want you to memorize the periodic table, and that's very important. And memorize the periodic table and all the electronic structures of atoms, particularly the transition metal elements, because when you get into difficult problems, say in ligand field theory, and you're working on something that has to do with iron +2 or something, you want to immediately spit out its 3d6, 6 3D electrons. You don't want to have to look that up and work for an hour to try to figure out its 3d6. You should know that immediately, because there are a lot of hard problems, and you don't want to waste time on the easy ones. So having said you shouldn't memorize anything, I'm now going back on my word and saying you should memorize the periodic table for sure, okay, and have a feeling for what the electronic structure of all the atoms and ions are. If you know that in chemistry, then you'll go a long way. You won't have to worry about thinking about counting electrons over from the last inert gas and stuff like that. You'll waste a lot of time. So if I say nickel +2, you should say 3d8. Say iron 3, you should say 3d5. If I said platinum 2, you should say 5d8, and so on. And so I can give you quizzes and throw out these elements and these oxidation states, and you should immediately reply to me exactly what the atomic structure is. Okay, that's your first assignment, Natasha. So I'm already teaching. So are you going to go to graduate school?
Hopefully.
Okay, in Sri Lanka, or are you going to come to US, or what are you going to do?
I would love to come to US. Yes, that is what I'm hoping.
Oh, great. We'd like to see you, wouldn't we, David?
Absolutely. Please apply.
Yeah, let's get Natasha here.